Okay, our next keynote speaker, presenter, has trained thousands of learning professionals, and she believes that HR can only shine when everything is done, delivered with meaning and purpose. Now, some of her main mottos are: there is no such thing as a boring topic, there's only boring training. And learning is only effective if people really learn to learn. Well, we are eager to learn more now from the co-founder of Stella Labs, Stella Collins. The floor is yours, Stella. Welcome.
Thank you, Anne. Hello, everybody. So we're going to think about change today and how we can stay relevant both in HR and in L&D. So, as Anne so kindly said, I'm Stella Collins, and I'm Chief Learning Officer and co-founder at Stella Labs, and I'm also the author of Neuroscience for Learning and Development. Now, our mission, our purpose at Stella Labs is to bust the skills gap that is coming at us rapidly, is still here, and is going to keep coming, with effective science-based training. However, I have another secret mission. Have you ever experienced training like this? Have you ever felt like this in a classroom? Have you ever felt like this doing digital learning? Have you ever been bored with training? Now, it just so happens that people really, really dislike boredom. They dislike it so much, they would rather suffer an electric shock and administer electric shock to themselves than be bored. So my secret mission is to make sure that nobody ever again says that training was boring, it was irrelevant, we wasted money on it, we wasted time on it, and we wasted energy on it. That is what I want to avoid for the future. And I'm going to explain a little bit about how to do that and why this is relevant for change and the change we're in. I'm curious about your purpose. Somebody yesterday in the conference talked about the importance for us to have a purpose, for leaders to have a purpose. So have a real think about what's your purpose, what gets you out of bed on a cold, wet Monday morning, gets you to work, or helps you staying at home at the moment, but gets you started working, and gets you all the way to the end of the week. What's your purpose for being in HR or in L&D? And I don't suppose it is delivering training courses or thinking about comps and benefits. There's something deeper. What's your deeper purpose? Now, we know change is happening. We've got climate change and environmental change. We've definitely got digital transformation and change. And, since COVID, we've also had incredible change in our lives and behaviours. What isn't changing is the fact that there is going to be a skills gap. There's going to be a massive talent deficit, so that in 2030 globally, there's going to be 85.2 million workers missing. I find that really hard to contemplate, but it means we're going to have to train people up, train them faster, train them more regularly, and they are going to have to learn. Change and learning go together. As we change, we learn, and as we learn, we change. But change brings about learning. In order to survive, that's what we've always done. We've gone from being, hunter-gatherers to farmers to modern technological beings. And in HR and L&D, what we need to do is to create a learning organisation in order to be able to create and keep that change and to survive for the future. So, what does learning look like in your organisation right now? I suspect it doesn't actually look quite like this great big, rather grand and beautiful library. But perhaps you have the equivalent of a great big, beautiful library, and you might call it a learning management system. And that's valuable and useful, but a learning management system is not learning. There are lots of other things that aren't learning. So training courses may be useful and part of learning, but they're not the learning itself. Nurturing people and supporting them is part of the learning, but it's not the entire process. And content is a valuable start to learning, but it is not the learning. So what does learning look like in your business context, in your workplace? Now, thanks to COVID, many of us have gone from what may have been a more traditional approach to training to really embracing digital learning. And I want to congratulate you if you have transformed your business or transformed part of your business right now into using digital technology, then well done, because that is the way we're going forward. But it isn't sufficient. If what you've done so far is just transform everything you had previously in books or in some other place and now put it online and given people access to content, that isn't really learning. It's digital content and it's valuable and it's necessary, but it's still not learning, because learning is about getting people to change their behaviors, to do things differently, to think differently, and to perform differently. Learning is actually the new way of working, and we need to learn in work. We need to learn in the context of work. So it turns out that many employees believe that on-the-job training delivers a better experience for their customers than it does if they're learning sort of traditionally in formal classrooms. Now, formal training still has a place, but it's not the only thing we need to do. But we do need to learn in the context of work. We do need to learn where it's relevant to us to learn, and we need to be able to apply that training, apply that learning in our workplace. So what are you going to do in HR? Are you supporting change in order to survive, or would it be better to help people really thrive, to help people and organizations to thrive and grow and develop? Because we're going to have to keep changing. Change is all around us, and it's going to keep happening. So there are some steps we must take. I truly believe we can embrace this change. We can embrace all the changes that are coming with us. But we need to be prepared and ready to do it. So I'm going to share those steps with you right now. At Stella Labs, we have what we call a DNA of effective learning. And these are all the things that we need to have as part of the change. So first of all, we need people, we need science, we need a process, we need technology, and we need to embrace data. And I'm going to explain those in a little more detail. So first of all, people. We need to bring on a learning revolution. We don't want a silo where L&D and HR are stuck in their own little space. We want to broaden it within the organization, so we are learning at work. So first of all, we as L&D people, we need to align with the C-suite. We need to understand what they're saying. We need to understand what they're looking for. We need to talk their language. And that's something you will often hear. But I think something we hear less often is actually we need to educate the C-suite to understand the value of what we bring, the value of learning to the organization, particularly during change, because we've already agreed that change and learning go together. So that's coming from the top. But what are we going to do coming from the bottom? From the bottom, what we need to do is to make sure that everybody knows how to learn. We all think we know how to learn. We went to school, we went to university. We've probably learned things at work. But actually, we don't really know how to learn. There's an awful lot of myths out there. There's an awful lot of stuff that people think will help them learn and doesn't help them learn. So helping people learn will help this sort of the top down and the bottom up and create an explosion of learning, an explosion of being able to deal with change, an explosion of performance. How would it be if in your organization everybody was just 1% better on their performance because they'd learned to learn really effectively? Every single person, 1% better. What would that do for your organization? We need to learn about the science so that we can investigate what's truly effective, what really works. If we don't know the science, we can't challenge things that are thrown at us. We can't challenge when somebody comes and says, there's a great new learning method, there's a great new idea. If we don't know the science behind learning, and I don't mean the science behind training, I mean the science behind learning, we can't challenge things. And we can't abandon old models. We hang on to old models. I might upset you here, But if you're still hanging on to the idea that people have learning styles, if you're still hanging on to the idea that MBTI, for instance, is a scientifically proven piece of research on personality, I'm afraid you're not right. And if you're still hanging on to the idea that we have left and right-brained people, it's not true. We need to abandon those old models and start using what there is out there, the evidence that shows how learning really happens and how people can really, really change behaviors, change attitudes, and change their skills. And then we need a learning transfer process. This isn't about an information transfer process. This is a learning transfer process. How do we get learning from wherever it is in the learning environment, wherever we learn to do something, wherever we first take those first wobbly steps, into our business, into our application at work, so we can actually use it? And that starts before, during, and after events. So really we want to stop doing events. We need to have people learning before they start learning, what are they wanting to learn? And then while they're learning, how are we supporting them? And then after the formal part of the learning, what are they doing to embed that into the workplace? Learning really is the new working. So it's about having a process. Learning is a process, it's not an event. So stop doing events if that's what you've been doing. And then technology is a tool. It's not a driver. So the technology is really useful, but it isn't sufficient. So with that evidence that you've got from the science, you can start to challenge suppliers so that you're not dazzled by the razzmatazz that they might say. If your suppliers don't understand learning, and they do understand the digital side, challenge them. Ask them how this affects the learning management systems that they're creating, the platforms they're creating. Do they really understand learning? And finally, we need data to measure the effectiveness of what we're doing so that we can talk to the C-suite, so that we can prove what we're doing works. And use the data that's already in your business. You don't need to go looking for new data. The data's already there. And select relevant data. A lot of learning data is not actually very relevant. It doesn't matter how long somebody sat sitting through a piece of e-learning. That's not relevant to how they're going to transfer it into the workplace, how they're going to transform their behavior and their skills. And finally, then we can measure, we can analyze that data, and then we can adapt what we do so that it is optimal, so that it is really helping support us through these changes. So I want you to be a part of the change. I want to invite you to think about these things and to think about how you, in L&D, in HR, can be part of the change that we're already immersed in, but how can we make it really effective and thrive for the future? We'd like you to join us at a post-summit roundtable. We'll post some ideas about this afterwards. But right now, I want you to think about the future and where you're going.
Okay, Stella, thank you very much for your presentation so far. We still got time for some questions, if that's okay with you. So you've talked a lot about learning experience. What exactly would be your definition of learning experience, and what is it composed of? What are the different components of learning experience that you mentioned?
So learning experience isn't quite sufficient, I don't think. People talk about learning experience a lot at the moment, but I don't think it's quite sufficient to actually help us learn. You need an experience, that's absolutely true. But I think first of all, in terms of learning, we need to be highly motivated, and as L&D people, we need to support people's motivation. We need to give them either experiences or knowledge or information or something to learn from. So the experience is what we learn from. And then we need to help them understand that make sense for themselves. This is part of this kind of learning process. How do they make sense of the experience, reflect on it, and understand where they can take that forward? And then usually, for people to actually take learning forward, they need to have really good, strong memory triggers, because if we can't remember anything, then we definitely can't apply it. And we need to practice. So when something's new to us, when we're learning, we need time to practice, we need to get feedback, we need to repeat it, we need to practice again and get feedback until we're beginning to feel more confident with it. And finally, we need to repeat that learning over time. So not just, in the training, in the event, in the day you first learn it. You need to repeat it over time for it to become a habit, for it to become a skill, for it to become something really that becomes a part of you. So the experience is important, but it's not quite sufficient.
It has to get really under your skin, if I understand well what you're
I
explaining.
think that's a really nice way of putting it, yes.
Yes. Are there any tricks, maybe, any tips how you can improve the learning experience from your personal experience? What are things that really get a good result?
Okay, so there's some really simple things you can do to support. If you're an L&D person or you're a learning person, or if you're learning for yourself, there are some really simple things you can do. So just remember for now the mnemonic LEARNS, L-E-A-R-N-S. First of all, link to what you already know. It's much easier to remember, it's much easier to learn new stuff when you can link it to what you already know. Use emotions. So we remember things that are emotional to us, they're important to us, we remember them much more easily. So how can you get an emotional content into what you're thinking about? You can anchor learning. This is kind of like Pavlov's dog, where he used to persuade dogs to eat food, listening to a bell, and then eventually they would salivate when they heard the bell. So how can you link something in the learning to something that people are going to meet regularly every day? So it's about creating an anchor, which is something that holds one thing to another. Repetition is still really important for learning. People sort of sometimes talk about rote learning not being important, but repetition is really important because that's what's strengthening our neural connections in our brains. Novelty is good for learning because we remember things that are new because they may be dangerous or they may be fantastic, but we have to pay attention to them in order to make that discrimination in the first place. And then finally, as humans, stories. Stories are so important to us. We've told stories for, well, ever since we sat around those campfires, probably even before we invented fire. So stories incorporate all those other elements. So just as really top tips, think about the mnemonic LEARNS, links, emotions, anchors, repetition, novelty, and stories.
Mm-hmm. Well, the same goes for giving a good presentation. If you need stories, if you tell stories, some anecdotes, people remember what you were saying during your presentations rather than charts and figures and facts. I think that's also true for a good presentation. Now, I'm wondering, can HR do something to motivate people to have a better learning experience, or to actually take the step to go and switch for the learning experience?
Absolutely. I mean, I think what we really need to do is to learn from marketing. Marketing and sales can sell us anything. We didn't know that we wanted the new iPhone, whatever. I don't even have an iPhone, but we didn't know we wanted that until marketing told us we really, really want it. So sometimes it's about exposing the gaps to people in, what they don't know, and selling that to them, but also using all those other techniques from marketing, persuasion techniques, getting people to understand the benefits of, what will happen when they've got this new learning, helping them see the future. It might be helping them visualize it. So there's many tools that you can use from marketing, making we'll come back to stories again, making stories really sticky, again using emotions. Much of sales stuff is done through emotions, creating a lifestyle, creating that kind of aspirational, when I've learned this, wow, then I'll be able to do that or get this job. I think use marketing. That's my top tip there.
Mm-hmm. And then I found one in our chat box, and it says, well, too many organizations still do not align their learning and development activities with performance management and employee engagement. So what should you recommend actually to achieve and sustain that alignment?
I think what we really need to do is to understand, in L&D sometimes we get really obsessed with learning, and that's great because learning is really interesting. I'm totally fascinated by it. Okay. But what we really need to do is understand, what does the business need? What do people need to be able to do their jobs? Not just well, but really effectively, and to drive the business forward. Where's the business going? Where do they need to be in the future? And how can they learn the skills they're going to need, not this week, next week, but actually in 2 years' time. And they need to start learning those skills now, because if they only start learning them in 2 years' time, they'll be new learners. They won't be masterful at the task. So it's really understanding the business, asking the questions of the business about what do you need in the business to move the business forward, and from then understand what the learning is. So I think a lot of the time in the past, people used to just say, what do the learners want? And actually that's nice because, then you're tapping into what they think they need. And I think we do need to ask that question as well. What do they feel they need? Because they're the ones who are doing the jobs right now. But I think we need to, talk the language of the business.
Do you think it works when you push people towards learning techniques and learning experience, or is that too offensive?
Do you mean push them into learning they may not want to do?
Yes.
No, I don't think it works. Because if they're not motivated in the first place, they may sit there, they may sit and take an e-learning course, they may sit in a training course, they may behave really nicely in the training course, but if they can't see the purpose. I have a story. Years and years ago, I worked in IT, and I went on a Oracle database course. It was a massive course. It was 2 weeks long. I didn't know beforehand why I was going. Nobody came to me afterwards and said, you've learned this in order to. I had no purpose to do it. Do I know anything about Oracle databases? Absolutely not. And, yes, I was compliant during the training. I joined in and I participated and I kind of got the exercises right. But I didn't learn anything that I could actually take forward into the future. It didn't stick with me for the long term. And that's what learning is about. It's about skills and knowledge that you can carry with you into that future where we're all hurtling all the time.
Yeah, and then a good one, I believe, while learning and development ranks high in all CEOs' minds, it is the first department or the first budget that is being cut when things go wrong. So how do you explain this paradox?
I think it's because it's not seen as a return on investment, and traditionally we haven't been very good at measuring that return on investment. So I think we need to, again, it's about talking to the business, being part of the business, understanding, what are the challenges on the business, rather than just thinking, this is a great training course we can put on, or this would be fantastic for people to learn. What do people really need to learn? So I think if we educate the C-suite about learning and the importance of learning and how learning and change and business and work all go together, then that will help us. But also, we have to show that we can deliver a return on investment. And I truly believe that using those items I talked about from our DNA, I think those are the things that we can help the C-suite to understand that, we're serious, we're not just something that needs to be cut, and that if they do cut learning, then what they will find is that people can't accelerate. And I think often the question that's quite a useful one to ask is, what if we don't continue training people? What if we just leave people where they are? What's the risk and the cost to the business there?
Yeah, good question. What do you think will be the cost?
Sorry, just say that again.
Yeah, no, you ended with a question, and can you answer that question yourself?
Can I answer the question?
Well, maybe you have an idea of...
Yeah. Sorry, I've forgotten the question already.
Well, okay, no worries. No, let's move to artificial intelligence and the impact on learning and development. Do you believe that indeed artificial intelligence will define the personal journey and learning development journey of an individual?
I think it's already defining our learning journeys. If you're on Amazon, you're reading books, which is part of a learning journey. Amazon is already suggesting to you what the next book you might read is. So AI is already defining our learning journeys. I think as AI develops and as L&D becomes more technologically competent with it, yes, we will be getting AI to help people select and choose the learning journeys they take. It won't take over. I don't think it'll take over. I don't think it'll necessarily replace our jobs, which is a fear some people have. But it is going to be a really high impact in terms of actually making that learning journey really effective. And again, tying into the business, because you can feed that data into the artificial intelligence.
Mm-hmm. And of course, for a company, it's always important to measure the impact of learning. Do you have any suggestions about which metrics are best used to efficiently measure that impact?
I think it's those KPIs that are in the business already. So what are you already measuring people on? It's much easier, for example, to measure sales training because, you know, has somebody made more sales? That's an easier thing to measure on.
Yeah.
It's easier to measure if it's something like, you know, can somebody code more quickly? Can they create more, you know, more apps faster? Once it comes to soft skills, that's a little bit more difficult. How do we measure behaviors? But there are still measures of behaviors. You know, how many disputes do we have within the organization? You know, how many disputes are HR having to monitor or to regulate? How many complaints do we get from customers about how our people behave? You know, and that might be internal customers as well as external customers. So that data is often there. It's just we need to go and unearth it. Maybe, and you know, this is again, it's about talking back to the business and finding out what's in the business. What are they already measuring that we can then say, okay, well, let's see. And learning will never be the only solution because you could do the greatest, best learning journey in the world. But if the business isn't supporting the change in behavior as well, then the learning is only, it's an influencer. It's a key and important influencer, but it can't do it all on its own.
Okay, and then one final question to wrap up your presentation. What will be your key recommendation, your key advice as far as learning and development, learning experience is concerned for the HR organization of the future?
I think my key advice is really to go and investigate what is the evidence behind what works for learning. What's the science behind it? And then that science is increasing all the time. So we've got social science, we've got cognitive science, we've got neuroscience, and all that is building. You know, there's a really strong evidence base already, and I think to professionalize ourselves, we need to be really aware of that evidence base and to use it. You know, not just be aware of it, not know it, but use it.
Okay. Thank you very much, Stella, for sharing your ideas, your visions with us today during this third day of the HR Leadership Summit 2020.